thinking that has led us to the kinds of success we've had as a civilization. I mean, we have a set of instincts and actions that have driven us towards this success because as communities, as individuals, we've been able to say, okay, if we focus on the short term and the narrow around us, the big picture will take care of itself. And of course, for the almost all of human history on this planet, 200,000 years, that's been the case, that if we focused on our short term and our narrow, we could be fine. But we've suddenly found ourselves over the past 200 years, 50 years, depending on how you calculate it, in a moment where we cannot just focus on the short term. Even though all our instincts tell us we can focus on the short term and be successful, we now have to change our way of thinking to think about the breadth and the depth of the impact of every single action. And that is a transformation of everything, from individual consumer choices to business decisions, to political leadership and political decisions, to everything we do. We're now having to take into account something that we never had to worry about before. And that's why it's so hard to get people to shift into that thinking. So the leadership of people in this room, people who understand that shift towards a long-term thinking actually means an understanding and respect of the natural world that underlies and supports everything else we do, from every business to every community to anything, any sort of human activity on this planet is built on layers of ecosystem services or natural processes that we take for granted, that we can no longer take for granted. And it's that shift that is most important, I think, to me, and that's certainly what I spent a lot of time reflecting on before getting into politics. And that shift of actually seeing that there is more of a political consensus around protection of vulnerable species and vulnerable areas is a very positive thing. Of course, one of the things that you always have to reflect on is, if you're protecting this particular area, that's great that you're protecting that area, but what are you suddenly saying about everything else that is surrounded and therefore not protected? So you can't just go around, making a national park here and say, well, that's what my contribution is. You have to think about what we're doing in other places as well. And that's why in our reflection on protecting areas and working with provinces and municipalities and businesses and investors, recognizing, yes, there are places that we need to protect and there can be no drilling, no resource extraction, no development because this is a particularly vulnerable or important place. But you also have to think about other places, how you manage intelligently and get the balance between economic benefits and sustainable long-term future. I mean, so much of the Earth's population relies on proteins from the ocean, relies on fish, that we have been drawing from our oceans as an economic benefit for so long that we need to start thinking about how we invest to be able to make sure that those resources are around for the long term. And that is fundamentally not just a moral argument, because for many of us a moral argument is enough, but in far too many cases in the world we have to also make an economic argument. But that economic argument is better and better able to be made. The challenge we face right now, I think, is one of almost a form of nihilism, where people are saying, you know what, we're all in trouble, we're all screwed, the planet's going in exactly the wrong direction, let's just, try and survive through the short term and leave the next generation to deal with whatever, because it's not going to last anyway. I think we know that we have the capacity, and obviously the Earth has the capacity to renew and to get back to a place of health. But we have to start doing it now in real and tangible ways. And that's where the partnerships are so important. That's where the vision is so important. And that's where a positive attitude, I mean, the environmental movement has always been torn between a doom and gloom, the world is ending unless you do this, unless you change that, and this idea of optimism that we actually have the capacity to make changes that are going to make a difference. And I think we are definitely seeing positive stories of things that we've done, even amongst the terrible news we see around extinction events and impacts of climate change around the world, that there is a real tangible role that we can have individually and collectively as positive agents of protecting our planet and protecting ourselves and mostly our future generations.
So do you feel perhaps, I mean, clearly in North America, not just in North America, but clearly right now, climate is a very polarized issue, unfortunately, and certainly in Canada. Do you feel perhaps that nature could be a way where we could bridge that gap between, because I think many people would agree with you that there's less tension around conservation, certainly in North America, than there is on climate. So perhaps, could nature be a bridge towards more action on climate change?
Well, I think it has to be. I mean, last year, Canada hosted and was president of the G7 meeting of most industrialized nations. And of course, because we were Canada and because it's me, we were going to make sure that environmental protection was a really big part of the discussion we had. However, when you think about the folks around the table, particularly our neighbor immediately to the south, there was going to be challenge that we saw in attaining consensus around bold action on climate change at the G7 leaders level, and we really wanted to make sure that we were united as an organization showing real leadership. So we said, okay, if we don't want to spend too much time arguing over climate change, as much as that pains me, is there something else we can do that will be a real positive and tangible focus on G7 leadership? And we said, okay, let's talk about the oceans. Let's talk about plastics in the oceans. Let's talk about how we're going to help small island developing states develop better resilience, both in their oceans, but also in the extreme weather events that are hitting them more often. How can we focus on oceans as a theme where we can get consensus? And specifically plastics in the ocean. That was something that we were able to use to significantly advance the conversation in a really important way. But I think we've only, as a global community, only started to appreciate that it's not just about separate subjects we can deal with, but they are all deeply interwoven. I mean, when we look at a country, as a country, on things like, okay, where do we need to protect a given area? Where should we build this next national park? Where should we create more marine protected areas? A lot of our reflections are, well, what kind of biodiversity is there? What kind of species at risk live there? What kind of, how is this place particularly unique and therefore required to be protected from human activity or development? And that's still going to be very important reflections. But I'm excited about the fact that over the past year or so, we've started to have conversations on more than just why is this unique and needs to be protected, but why is this a useful area as a carbon sink, as a way to protect and to fight against climate change, and looking at protecting the boreal forest, for example, as being a place that is extraordinarily important as a sink, as a generator of oxygen. These are the kinds of things that we have to start thinking about, how protecting our waters, protecting our land, and fighting climate change can and will go together. And I don't think we've properly explored, either scientifically or politically, all the levers that we actually have where we can develop more impact in fighting climate change. And I think the more people can understand the fact that all these different subjects are all interconnected and connected to you as a consumer, as an individual, as a citizen in so many different ways, that we have just one planet. And we have to take all these different approaches and angles in terms of how we protect it and make it smart and make it reasonable and make it connected to people in the things that they are passionate about, whether it's their kids' future, whether it's innovative technologies, whether it's beautiful places and hiking or traveling through them, whether it's just appreciating it. I mean, there are ways to awaken a sense of responsibility in every single individual on this planet. And we have to try and figure out how to connect all those in to the different themes we have to work on.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about how do we break the silos, and it's true internationally as it is domestically. We have an international convention on climate change, we have one on biodiversity, desertification, and we have a Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and a very good minister at that, and a very good minister of fisheries. But how can we do that from a public policy perspective, from a governmental perspective? How do we do it?
Well, I mean, one of the challenges we had as a government coming in almost 4 years ago was that government really naturally does separate itself into silos, like so many organizations or like so many people, where you have, the environment was doing one thing, and then, Department of Industry was doing something else completely at loggerheads, and the Minister of Natural Resources and the Minister of the Environment traditionally never got along in any government, and we discovered so many different blockages that weren't just at the upper levels, but trickled down through the whole public service, where people were focusing on their responsibilities, and it's my job to get our exporting of minerals up and develop new opportunities, and I'll let someone else worry about the environment, and in conversations between each other we'll figure out what the right path is. Well, we're much more trying to shift towards a holistic approach, or a whole of government approach, where protecting the environment is every single department's responsibility, not just the Department of the Environment. I mean, there's a theory out there that there shouldn't be a Minister of the Environment. I don't think we're ready for that. Don't worry, Catherine. But every department, every ministry, everyone would be responsible for protecting the environment within what they do. And that idea of being more holistic and whole of government in that approach applies to so many things, not just the environment. It applies to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It can't just be about the ministries that have titular responsibilities for that relationship. It has to be broader, and natural resources, and labor and skills development, and everyone needs to be able to feed in to all these different subjects. And that's where government by cabinet, where we actually make decisions with everyone around the table, not just a select few, where making sure that the approach and accountability through the public service connects as well is really important. But then, of course, you get to the international area where people have different agendas. They get elected, or even within Canada, you have people who are committed to fighting climate change getting voted in by people who are indifferent to the fight against climate change being voted in at the same time at different orders of government. And how you work together that way is a bit of a challenge. How we work with neighbors in other countries around the world that have very different imperatives, different levels of development, different opportunities, different responsibilities, different levels of wealth. Getting everyone onto the same page and understanding that this is something that we all need to do together is the big challenge of our time. And gatherings like this one, and specifically the gathering that this is leading into next year at the Conference of the Parties in China, is going to be essential for making that real action happen at a time where, of course, we all think that the time we are living in and acting in and leading in is the most pivotal time in the history of the world. But I think there's a real argument to be made that right now, with the transformation that our world is going through, with the pace of change, with the technological developments, with globalization, the decisions we make now will really impact irrevocably the course of our species over the next few decades. And that is why this moment where we gather together to stand up, stand together, and take action is so important.